It's something close to that, but not quite.
Yeah, because then we're both wrong now. So that applies.
Well, with you and me, I can just talk about it. So we have philosophical differences.
Hold on, I have to put this all over my arm.
So debate round?
Do you ever have times where you wish you could be Mark Harris and just be like, fact check everyone?
Man,
Like,
maybe
it's
like
not
once,
Darren.
like a long time ago.
Are we good? Are we set?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna go on that.
Yeah.
Conservation one resolution analysis should evaluate this on
Louder.
louder. All right.
Yeah.
You should evaluate this on that benefits because most provides most access to predictable offense defense protein. Additionally, word should in the resolution indicates it should be a policy rather than all the adjustments will be contextual. The plain text: the U.S. federal government should end all of its military arms sales to the state of Israel within normal means. The red, we're doing all of it. Any question on that? No. Cool. Solvency. First off, this would happen immediately. The second is that this would end all pending sales and all current weapons would not be delivered. So, I mean, pretty simple. We're not just be selling any more weapons. Everything's not going to be delivered. There's not going to be anything going from the United States to any arms sales from the United States to Israel. Advantage one is non-state act for violence.
Wait, quick question.
Yeah.
So you end current deals like the December deal that included like 3,000 bunker busters?
If the weapons haven't been delivered, they're not going to go. Advantage one. Uniqueness, the U.S. unconditional support has angered nations all across the world and critical allies everywhere. We indicate that this Europe has condemned, for example, Israel's actions toward Palestinian settlements. Additionally, Russia has also followed suit in this. The international community really don't like U.S. action and unconditional support of Israel. The second is that predominantly Muslim nations and others, but this also includes others in the Middle East and Africa, are really pissed about our support and have called out for and we've been called out by leaders of all of these nations. The third is that non-state actors like Osama bin Laden had isolated criteria that how we could have avoided non-state actor violence. The indication was that unconditional support of Israel and arms sales was the number one most important thing. So stopping that anger of non-state actor violence and retribution against the United States. Fourth is that non-state actors attacks are coming now. In 2008, a panel of 200 scientists indicated that there was a likely attack that was going to happen in 2013. It means the brink is literally coming up right now. This is the U.S.'s poor relations with those traditional allies and allies in Africa. We can't get intelligence from these people because they don't want to actually work the U.S. government because we have because of our association and unconditional support of Israel via the links. First, the plan immediately ends all arms sales and this essentially brings us all in line with the international community norms because the way to not be unconditionally support Israel. We're essentially the only nation that continues to do this unconditional support, so that brings us in line with the international community norms. The second is that this would be a massive olive branch to the Muslim world and African nations even nations with secular governments, but predominantly Muslim populations. The third is that the plan shifts domestic perception of Muslims within the United States. Right now, the FBI, New York police are profile highly, and this is of these groups, and this causes a ton of mistrust. And they even when their profiling doesn't happen, they still face prejudice from just like regular citizens. The plan is an olive branch to all of these individuals that are even within the United States, and so that means they'll be more likely or willing to work with intelligence agencies because they view the U.S. government as trying to make positive steps in terms of bringing cultural ties with other nations around the world. The fourth is that this brings the U.S. in line with also with Russian policy on Israel because they would essentially see the U.S. as being more in line with their policy and making reasonable policy that brings them in line with Russia. The internal links. First, that our allies essentially refuse to spell or don't want to share intelligence, will specify our European allies as essential to preventing attacks from non-state actors. In a world where we are closer in terms of how we conduct our foreign policies, a world where there's going to be more intelligence agency cooperation. So these relations are expanded, and that means that we can actually share more data and be more effective in terms of collecting intelligence worldwide. Second, the communities in the United States are uniquely critical. Non-state actor, the people that analyze the violence of non-state actors around the globe say that domestic communities are critical. There's a lot of evidence indicating that people actually knew that there are a lot of citizens of the United States that knew that 9/11 was actually going to happen, and if they had actually spoken up, we could have actually prevented the attack. They just didn't want to speak up because they didn't feel like they could trust intelligence agencies. They couldn't trust the United States because of our policy towards Israel. The third is that relations with African countries are also critical, and even across the Middle East. The Al Qaeda is expanding all across the globe. This includes in Africa. You can look to Somalia and Mali as examples where and the United States is looking towards and trying to take action because we know that Al Qaeda and other non-state actors are expanding in these areas. The U.S. response unilaterally is never going to be sufficient and would continue to cause resentment, which means that we need support from international communities and governments abroad. The fourth is that the hearts and minds of the Middle East are critical to stopping support and recruiting efforts. The end of this is that the U.S. is perceived as this evil demon, and there's a caricature of the United States as a unilateral actor that hates every other nation in the world. And this caricature that is set up allows non-state actors to do things like recruitment and get sentiment against the United States to actually conduct attacks. We live in a world where we can break down this caricature. That won't happen anymore. Fifth international link is Russia is also uniquely critical to resolve sources of loose chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Essentially, when we can work with Russia, we are able to share intelligence to prevent leakage of these kind of materials and impacts. First, that an immediate attack on the United States would immediately kill thousands of people, if not millions, if a big enough weapon was able to be detonated in large urban centers. This is both an immediate impact, and it also would cause a lot of xenophobia. You can classify how the links. You can classify the link analysis here that more xenophobia is only going to cause more distress and more distress. The second impact is that the U.S. response would be immediate and massive. We would be raining bombs down on targets of convenience in order because we would see it as an existential threat when there's an attack, a massive attack on the United States. I'll get you at the bottom. A massive attack on the United States domestic territory. Or we would invade numerous countries like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan to hunt down massive non-state actor networks in order to try to shut them down. We can indicate that this has a propensity to go nuclear. And when we're actually invading again into the Middle East, there's a propensity for actors like Pakistan or India to actually start launching nuclear weapons, or for non-state actors to get access to nuclear material, and these detonations would give them an atmosphere to cause extinction. Your question, real quick.
Yeah. Who is the U.S. going to rain bombs on?
Well, our indication is that there's intelligence. We have likely ideas of where NSA networks are, and we would start raining bombs on all these people.
NSA network.
Non-state actors. The third impact is that better relations resolve transnational problems. We would isolate zoonotic diseases as a massive problem. Health agencies in Europe and Africa, we need these health agencies to collaborate to fight epidemics. Zoonotic diseases are uniquely bad because humans don't actually have any immune response to these kinds of diseases, which means that this means that these are uniquely bad, and globalization guarantees that these diseases would be spread. Only when we actually get as the more and more that we actually move into nature and have more interaction with animals, where these zoonotic diseases just come from, is more and more there's more and more chance for these zoonotics to come up in a world where that happens with globalization. This guarantees extinction because we literally know immune response to any of these diseases. You can look to how Ebola kills really, really fast. That's the zoonotic disease.
Case advantage 1 in the order of advantage 1, 2 off.
Are either of them my wallet?
I
guess. On the big one. Or do I need extra pieces of paper?
Yeah. Yeah. Alright. Thanks. Everybody good? Cool. First is 3 reasons as to why uniqueness overwhelms the link and you have no propensity to stop non-state actors in the status quo. The first is that the U.S. is still going to be providing billions of dollars in military aid. No discursive reason as to why you stop aid from going, or for that matter, military aid from happening. We think that in a world where we're also providing aid to Saudi Arabia, you have no propensity to check the ideological differences. Second, we would say that the U.S. is often referred to as crusaders, indicating a larger ideological difference than simply that of weapons, which would seem to be another thing that you cannot overcome. Third argument under this, that in a world where there is still military intervention that takes place in the status quo, there would also seem to be no propensity for you to solve for this. Also, link level argument. Our link level argument is that in a world where the U.S. stops selling, there's still other types of military support that exists, as well as the fact that Israel is still able to get arms from other actors such as China. And the next argument under this, that on your Russia argument, lol, why would the U.S. ever model after Russia? Russia's also the same group that denies what is happening in Syria now on your internal links. First argument on your internal link is we think that intel sharing is happening now. Second is you have no specific reason as to why or which countries are not willing to trade intel. And the third argument under this is turn. We would argue in a world where the United States no longer has a diplomatic foothold in the Middle East, then there's no propensity for other groups to intelligence share when it appears as though the U.S. is backing off of those commitments. And the next argument under this, we'd say that the U.S. knew that 9/11 was happening. It's only a matter of internal action taking place. No reason as to why you were uniquely able to stop the expansion of Al-Qaeda, particularly when your empiric relates to Mali, which at last check France was in right now. And next argument into this, that you have no propensity to access hearts and minds. We would argue, if anything, turn. You only create a situation in which you are still funding, but you are not actually funding weapons. Creates a situation in which the U.S. is attempting to look like a good guy, but that guy isn't necessarily seen through. And we think that only inspires more hate to happen on your Russia critical resource argument. Two answers to it. First, Jackson Lugar means that the relations are always going to be kind of bad. And the second argument into this, we think that collaboration over arms is inevitable since start. And the next argument into this, that your arguments about detonation are problematic for a few reasons. First is non-unique, or is your impact is non-unique in a world where the GOP is still fundamentally xenophobic. And the second argument into this is we have no idea who bombs are being rained down upon now. No reason as to why you get traction on an impact that has no specificity to it. And the last few arguments we'll make on your healthcare argument, or on your health argument. First is the World Health Organization checks all of those harms. Second is a mutual interest in checking pandemics. The reasons why there's always international collaboration that takes place over issues like international health. First off, these unique selections to the Israeli legislators are coming in the status quo on January 22nd. The first argument of this, the Council on Foreign Relations says that there are two paths for Netanyahu based on the election, shape the emergent condition, hard right or the centrist left. And the second argument of this, the CFR also said as of yesterday that 25% of the electorate is undecided, and another 25% may change its mind. The question is not Likud whether or not that party does well, but what the distribution of votes will be like. And people like this last party, like Israel Batanu, a hard-right party to capitalize on fear prior to the election. The word of this, the far-right parties will do well and be the only parties with which Netanyahu can form coalitions. They've actually become the kingmakers in a world of planned passage. We think that this becomes likely because abandonment of U.S. support allows these factions that were previously fragmented in the status quo to coalesce around a common cause. Impact. Yeah.
Are you saying was your argument that Netanyahu's still going to get elected just to form coalitions?
Yeah. Impact. First, the hardline right justifies an Iran strike. The war for this that Israel, if you're not having the military technological capacity to check Iran in the future, in this case, you're necessarily stripping them of 28 GBUs, which means that they have to strike now with what they do have. The second argument under this, that the parties are so nationalist, they're likely to enact racist policy. The word of this, the head of Israel, Batanu, said that Arab Israelis should become different status, and in 2009 said that Israel needs to fight Hamas in Gaza like the Americans to Japan, interpreted by many, including Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan, as an allusion to the justifying a nuclear strike. Last argument on the impact. This turns case, world of Israel instability in the region means there's zero propensity to check instances of violent non-state actors in the region. Probably a reason as to why cooperation gets tanked. Next off. The alt text. Vote op as an act of willing life. Again, vote op as an act of willing life. Thesis. Or observation 1 is the thesis policymaking seeks to end suffering, but suffering is an inevitable part of life. This struggle necessarily blinds us to the positive, leaving us unable to cope with everyday existence. Two terms for the round. The first is the will to truth, which is the longing for a better world, and the will to life, which is embracing the world as it is. Again, will to truth. Yeah, your question?
Status of the alt.
conditional. Our interpretations, we can attest to the methodology and the status quo, a few reasons as to why that's good in the land of this. We think this is key to fostering advocacy and considering our own roles in violence. The second argument into this, we think this is always going to be key to the most educational type of literature in a world where we're engaging in academically. And the second argument under this, we think that in a world where your plan is done through the ethic of imagining a better world, you are necessarily devoid of truth claims because you are skipping from the A to C. We have seen this empirically throughout history. We've seen that history has been attempted to be preordained, but it is in fact unpredictable means that you give them zero propensity for solvency arguments. Link. First argument of the link is the plan is necessarily the longing for a better world. You attempt to solve all of the conflicts that exist with people of different ideologies by passing a plan and taking the weapons away from Israel without addressing the root cause. The second argument into this, we think that this is necessarily the will to truth. The third argument into this, we think that you act through a flawed ethic of obligation. This is necessarily a flawed epistemology that means you have no propensity to solve. And the fourth argument into this, you don't. Is that we think that in a world where we have no understanding of it, there's zero impetus to solve in the long-term impact. First argument on the impact is this is akin to a businessman that works 90 hours a week but doesn't get any play on the side. There's no value to life. The second argument of this is we think people that in a world of the PMC we necessarily become trapped in the problem solution mindset where we go from one problem to the next, rendering the PMC impacts worthless. And the third argument of this is historically actions to resolve conflict that are ill-conceived or at least half-baked have gone rather poorly. We would point to Iraq as an example. We think that these things where we take actions without considerations necessarily turns case or gut solvency. And the fourth argument into this, we think that your plan is necessarily an emotional response to a complex solution. It is a fast action. Little into this, we think that when you take such an action, this is done so without the consideration of the root cause of such problems. We would say that the war on terror has been problematic in that respect. And a little bit into this, we think that that's a reason to why there's zero propensity to solve in the long term. And the fourth argument into this, we've already taken your questions. The fourth argument into this, in a world of caricatures in a world where you place things into caricatures of the world, this creates a politic or an environment in which you can externalize the blame onto other people. We form groups and justifications when we take out or we enact instances of violence. We would say that this is a root cause of violence. On solvency. First, we think the alternative is necessarily a discursive space by which we can evaluate the academic and, for that matter, consider the consequences of our actions. Second is we're able to reorient ourselves by no longer viewing suffering as a unique problem. The third argument under this, we think that we're able to detach ourselves of these same sort of bonds. Also, we think in a world where we are detaching ourselves, or for that matter, accessing a discursive space, we avoid making hierarchical decisions that are necessarily problematic. And the fourth argument under this, we would say that in a world where the will to truth and the will to life are diametrically opposed, that is reasons to why the permutation does not work out. No more arguments, but we think we probably bite the double line pretty hard.
All right. Yours can be case. And then it is going to be the alternative. I just put that all in. Just that on bottom.
One more time, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Case. Alt. Shift F.
So do we need the other sheets?
I just put it on one. Do you?
I will.
You check to see if there's anything in
No, there's definitely stuff in here. Judge ready?
Total solvency extended across the entire solvency that indicates this would stop all sales immediately, and as well as all future sales and all pending sales, which indicates we have immediate solvency for the author is going to be important in impact discussion when we have an immediate time frame for all of our impacts. Go to the advantage now. The first argument they make is not unique. The United States still funnels in billions of dollars in military aid. Look, that doesn't matter in a world where we are no longer supplying actual physical weapons to Israel for them to enact physical violence on other individuals. It means that we're able to solve back to the problem of terrorism as well as the hearts and minds of individuals within the Middle East. But the second argument they say that the United States is referred to as crusaders. Our argument is that this mainly in terms of the United States' unconditional support of Israel. The plan is a critical step away from that, meaning that this is an unprecedented step in United States foreign policy where we are actually taking a step away from Israel. We're taking a step away from being crusaders, which
indicates that this is that this argument goes away, but additionally but the next argument is that us being crusaders manifests itself in us selling weapons to individuals, which indicates that once we stop selling weapons to people, we'll no longer be seen as crusaders. But the next argument, they say that we're going to still be viewed poorly because of interventions. Look, we are winning way too many arguments that indicate that Israel is the critical linchpin, which means that all of these arguments are interesting but irrelevant for the next argument. Yeah, but additionally, our military interventions are going down. We haven't intervened in Syria yet, and we also haven't taken significant enough action throughout Northern Africa, which indicates that there is absolutely no propensity of this argument being true. But the next, they make another argument that there's other type of military support advanced that above. But the next argument they make is that why would we model Russia? We're not trying to model Russia. We're just kind of trying to fall in line with international norms so we can intel share. That is the entirety of our affirmative that goes completely unanswered. At least that component goes completely unanswered, which means that you should be giving us credence on that argument. But the next argument they say is intel sharing. Now, literally no warrant for this. Our argument is that biochemical weapons were stolen out of Russia last year, which indicate, and we have no idea where they went, which indicates that intel sharing is probably pretty shitty right now. But go to their link terms. Their first link turn is that we don't have a diplomatic foothold within the Middle East. If all their arguments about how we still provide other types of support are true, that probably means that this argument goes away. But the next argument, they say that there's going to be no expansion of violence in the status quo. Look, this is not true. Our unique evidence indicates that there is a terrorist attack coming now, but a non-state actor attack coming now. Sorry. The ninth argument they make is that their argument is that when we still give them funding but not weapons, the United States looks like it's trying to play some sort of face, trying to be some sort of good guy. Our argument is that our shitty representation internationally is because we sell physical weapons to individuals. That is the thesis of our entire advantage, which indicates that this argument is not responsive. But the 10th argument is Jackson Vanik is getting repeated. Is Jackson Vanik is somehow relevant to U.S.-Russian relations? Our argument is that the Middle East is a much bigger sticking point between the United States and Russia, which indicates that if we can shore up those relations, we can make Russian relations much better. But the next argument they make is that there's going to be no detonation, no warrant for this. But additionally, they make the argument that the GOP is going to be xenophobic. Look, it's mainly manifests itself in Islamophobia, which indicates that stopping arms sales to Israel would shore this up. But additionally, they make the argument that the WHO is going to be able to check for zoonotic diseases. That's absolutely not true in a world where there's no collaboration between African countries, which we have isolated as being specifically important. And that is where many of the zoonotic diseases actually originate, which means that through relations with African countries is absolutely necessary.
WHO doesn't do research on.
And WHO doesn't do research on zoonotics, so it doesn't matter. Sent across the entirety of the internal links that indicate that allies don't want to intelligence share with us now, and specifically our ally that indicates that communities within the United States are absolutely key, which is something that the affirmative or the negative can absolutely not solve backwards. Sent across the entirety of our impact scenarios that indicates that we have an inroads to extinction. This is going to be a straight term denialism. This is a disadvantage to the alternative. We'll get to there when we get there, though. The alt. Oh, okay. First argument is proof you both pass the plan and can you just read your credit? I honestly cannot read this. Okay, firm, do the plan, and affirm life. Do the plan, affirm life. Follow it. First argument is the permutation is legitimate as all the plan and part of the council plan. The next argument is the permutation is that beneficial. The first argument is that these are only mutually exclusive in a world where you assume totalizing truth in a world where you think that two things can only exist in two separate spaces. Our argument is that this is internal into totalitarianism in a world where an individual gets to decide what methodologies are mutually exclusive, not mutually exclusive. This means that that a despot can get into power and completely dehumanize the entirety of the population. But go to the impacts. The first argument is, yeah, some suffering is inevitable, but the suffering that comes from nuclear holocaust is probably not inevitable. Our argument is that suffering that isn't inevitable is probably bad. The next argument is that the next argument is that when suffering, we're not really acting because the amygdala in our brain is actually making decisions, which is why torture works so effectively. We are not actually making conscious decisions that engage in our agency, which means that you're not going to be able to get your agency back or your value to life back in the world of the alternative. But the next argument is that the suffering, the logic of suffering inevitable is used to justify really shitty action and fatalistic actions like the alternative justify pre-existing order and aggression, meaning that, slavery exists now, but it's suffering, and suffering is inevitable, so we shouldn't do things about it. This justifies absolutely terrible atrocities against individuals and probably is even more life-denying than any of their arguments on the criticism. But the next argument is that action is key to value to life. If you're not free to actually act, it means that you can't express your agency, which means that you probably should take action before you can express any sort of value to life. And the next argument is The next argument is that extinction is inevitable without action. This means immediate extinction. This does not mean that we get to live our lives and experience some cool things within our life. It means that we die immediately in a world where we don't take any action. But the next argument is just because death is inevitable, it isn't not a reason not to die, which indicates that even though death is inevitable, we still want to prolong life. All right. Specifically, on their impact arguments, they say that we externalize groups in order to justify action with the plan as a decisive step to break the group, to break the relationship between the United States and Israel. We have advocated that from the start, and that is the entire rhetoric of our 1AC. But go up to framework. First argument is the counterinterpretation of the negative gets one advocacy to weigh against the few added impacts of the act. First argument is that we substitute literally 100% of your framework arguments. You still get your K, but you have to weigh it against the F, which means that if we win a risk of nuclear war, you're always going to vote F for the next argument. Sorry, this is super messy. Go back down to impacts. Extinction outweighs in a world where we are preserving life. That is the eternal intending sort of value to life, which means that if we win a risk of saving the world from extinction, it means that you're always going to vote F. They have no articulation of why value to life is important. Our argument is that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances like the Holocaust, individuals still have narratives, individuals still have stories, which indicates that you can always come back from value to life. You can't come back from death. Go to the disad. Their first argument is that the hardline right means that there's going to be an Iran strike. Our argument is that turn the unconditional support from the United States increases the propensity for the aggressive Israel. The first argument is that Israel's used a rhetoric of the military edge, where they believe that they can beat literally anybody in the region, which indicates that once we take away the weapons from them, they will no longer have this thirst for blood. But the next argument is that ending arms sales increases the exposure to Palestinian centers, which indicates that they are going to have to deal with shit domestically before they go out and bomb Iran, which indicates that this is very unlikely to occur. But the next argument is next argument is that they're going to be less likely to strike Iran because they're going to be seen as massively more vulnerable in a world where they don't have United States weapons in order to combat any sort of attack from them. But the next argument is that there's going to be no diplomatic shielding for Iran because they know that relations within the United States are strained, which indicates that there's absolutely no propensity for your Iran scenario. It does not turn terrorism. Turn that into.
I'll talk about the impact on criticism, then the advantage, and then the disadvantage.
Sorry, one more time.
Yeah, so alt page, the impacts on the criticism briefly, then the advantage, then the disadvantage. Extended permutation, just a type of competition, means that these two ideas are not mutually exclusive. Also, that answers your net benefit of permutation, which means there's no offensive reason to reject us because we don't adopt a totalizing idea. We adopt the idea of compromise that's implicit in permutation. On the impacts of the K, briefly. Your argumentation as to why like all of the impact terms on the criticism do not function as a reason as why we should lose. They're not independent forms of offense. As per our framework, they're just reasons as to why your methodology is a good idea, which means that if we adopt the same methodology by going for the disadvantage as a reason why the policy implications of the plan are a bad idea, that is not a reason that we should lose. There's simply reasons why the methodology problem solving is good, which means there's no independent offense on the criticism that's going to function as a reason to reject us outside of the or in the framework that we have in mind. So it means we're not going for the criticism. It goes away. No independent offense that can be used against us. Let's go to the case versus disadvantage. On the uniqueness. Critical misunderstanding on the first argument that Jacob makes, which says that we still give them billions of dollars in military aid. They say we're not giving them guns anymore. This is simply false. The case is that we continue to give them guns and planes. That's what military aid is, and we also allow them to buy them from other people because they get the money, but we're not selling our own weapons to them. That is the difference, which means that there would still be propensity for them to get these weapons from us in the first place, which means there's absolutely no propensity for you to solve, and the uniqueness overwhelms the link, but also that even if it's just military aid, just money that they're getting, not just selling them a bunch of weapons, or not just giving them a bunch of weapons and military aid, which is what's been happening in this quo, then they could still buy the weapons from everybody else. That's the argument Jacob makes about how other countries are going to fill them in. This is the link term that is absolutely not responded to. That Jacob says in a world where the U.S. stops selling these weapons, other arms sales like China, countries that have absolutely no conscience when it comes to selling arms to countries, fill in the gap. That makes it impossible for you to have any sort of solvency. But you are also conceding the second argument Jacob makes, which means that aid to Saudi Arabia means there's absolutely no check for regional stability because you're still all the anti-American sentiment, even if you're winning arguments as to why Israel may be the number one concern, there's still enough propensity for people to backlash against the aid going to Saudi Arabia that there would be no you will not be able to. The uniqueness will still overwhelm the link. There's no propensity for your link to undo the amount of anti-American sentiment that's already there, which means you don't get any risk of your impact. But last, you say on the let's go to the Crusaders argument. Jacob isolates the fundamental problem. What is the fundamental problem here, which is an attitude that the West is trying to crush and dominate the East in a religious crusade. That's how the issue is perceived by a lot of people. You say your argument is that unconditional support of Israel is the only reason that this is actually the case, but your sovereignty advocate for this is Osama bin Laden, which is probably not a very verifiable source. He will say whatever he wants to. Also, this the characterization of it as a religious dilemma means that it has more to do with Israel. Yes, this may be one policy concern, but this was literally, he outlined things that the U.S. should have done to avoid 9/11 and things that the U.S. should do in the future. Probably not things that would actually resolve the root cause of this, but just something on the surface that would be an additional benefit to those groups. But it's also a form of distraction essentially to the American public, saying this is what your policymakers could have done, your policymakers have failed, which means those arguments aren't valid. Those are all reasons why this is absolutely overwhelming.
At the very least, in the status quo with U.S. arms sales, we can check it back. We can't check China's arms sales.
At the very least, the United States has control over the arms sales when we are selling it to Israel. In a world where we allow China to fill in, there's absolutely no control, which means that probably turns your dissat pretty tough because all of these all of the problems that come from regional instability, and when there's still anti-American sentiment, that just means there's more likelihood for that sort of attack to happen. If I go to the let's see, the last argument on actually intel sharing doesn't matter. Let's go to the turn on hearts and minds. This is a pretty important argument. Jacob says that in a world where you're still funding them and not selling weapons, it looks like the U.S. is just being hypocritical. This is absolutely crucial because in a world where the Middle East and the people who have this anti-American sentiment see the problem as the United States being hypocritical, not being willing to internalize problems or costs, but actually externalize them to the rest of the world, just makes it look like they are trying to two-face the Middle East again, saying that we're going to abandon this rhetoric, but in actuality we're going to continue doing it, which means that even if the money that's given in military aid is considerably less than the arms sales, it's the perception that the United States is straight up lying as an attempt to gain international credibility that causes the impact to be turned worse. There is absolutely no way they can win the hearts and minds of the world where they're still giving Israel military aid. That is still unconditional. It is simply the sale of arms to these countries that goes away, which means you are not solving whatsoever for unconditional support of Israel. But you also can see the argument that Jacob makes, second point, on Russia, which says that there will always be collaboration over arms since START and other arms agreements, which means there's at least some propensity that we info share with countries like Russia over arms sales. Last argument I want. Actually, second to last argument, is the non-unique that Jacob makes on the impact level. He tells you that in a world where the GOP is xenophobic, that means that these impacts are inevitable. Their argument is that arms sales somehow short-circuit this. Absolutely not true. We would say this causes more xenophobia in a world where the GOP perceives us as abandoning Israel, makes it more likely for them to lash out against Muslims and individuals in the country that are the only locus for their possible hatred and frustration, which means that that's another turn to your own impacts and implications, means that more xenophobia happens because the GOP feels threatened and feels like it has to take action. Last argument is the second one on disease check. Do you concede the argument? Jacob says mutual interest means that countries will always cooperate in order to resolve diseases and pandemics once they become a big enough issue for it to matter, which means terminal defense on your impact.
You have to answer the Africa argument.
Which one?
They say that Africa doesn't collaborate.
Yeah.
The WHO doesn't have.
They say the WHO doesn't have doesn't evaluate these sorts of types of diseases. We would say there's at least propensity for it to do so in the status quo, or that will happen at a point where those diseases become more proximal. But regardless, we are still going to be winning in terms to xenophobia, which probably outweigh your disease scenarios because they're predicted the best. But it's sad. Problematic that you get to the disadvantage with only 50 seconds left because your arguments are not interacting with the specificity of ours. Your first argument is a term. If you say unconditional support, it makes it unlikely that an Iran strike is going to happen because they think that they can beat anyone. This is simply false. The argumentation on the link level is very intuitive, and the impact level, which is that in a world where Israel sees that it's no longer getting the weapons that it needs to be able to check Iran, in other words, the bunker busters it would need to disrupt the facilities that are the main reason for which it would attack Iran, it sees U.S. support is going away now. They're not selling us these weapons anymore to the extent that they are. We're not getting the GBU-28 package, thousands of them. That means that Israel probably freaks out and uses the weapons while they have them because they understand that Iran is only going to get further and further underground and harder to strike, which means that increases the propensity for an Israel strike to happen right now, which means we're getting immediate time frame for impacts. But the last argument, a couple more arguments. The second one, you say that somehow increases how the Palestinian issue is being more important. We say absolutely not true. Iran will always be more of a threat because it's considered an existential one to the point where nuclear weapons would be used to wipe out Israel. The third argument, you say that Israel is somehow seen as more vulnerable, and that helps relations. Not good for Israel to see itself as vulnerable, only causes it to strike other countries. And last, you say there's no, what's the diplomatic shielding argument we have?
I just have no shield.
You say, you say no diplomatic shielding, not really, no explanation as to what this argument actually means. We would say that there's still a propensity for Israel to strike Iran, but let's extend the dissent line by line. On the uniqueness,
Question?
Yeah, sure.
So you're saying that they don't have the bunker busters now, so they are not going to be affected?
They're getting a shipment of 3,000 of them, as per the question that
You need
you
to
asked.
answer the military rhetoric. They say that because of the change in military rhetoric, there's no longer a bloodthirst.
Yeah, right. You say no longer any sort of military rhetoric or bloodthirst. We say not true when they're still getting the military aid in the first place. Also not true when the entire political party feels like it has more reason to attack. That increases the bloodlust because they think that they have to act now because there's an existential threat coming. But extended uniqueness arguments in particular, you're conceding that the elections are coming right now and there are two possible paths. 50% of the electorate might change their mind. In a world where the U.S. stops selling arms to Israel, probably pretty likely that the far-right coalition will win. That grants us access to our impacts, which we say that first, it turns case entirely because it increases the perception of Israel as a rogue actor in something and will basically be more militant to other countries, but you're also conceding that this will go nuclear and cause parties to be racist against other countries because they are and other individuals because the leadership of this party is so messed up. Those arguments are all conceded. Probably going to outweigh case, even though we're turning it.
Israel takes advantage one in order. Overview on the top. Two ways you can vote for peace, Silganai, at the end of the round. Either you buy, well, actually, you should buy both. But we have the argument on the Israel ticks that functionally says, in a situation where there's an abandonment or perceived abandonment of U.S. support to Israel, this is the only situation in which an election that is kind of donezo right now has the propensity for coalition building to take place. We tell you that this same coalition building that takes place results in a hardliner party that is willing to capitalize on their particular political position in this unique instance. That's the impact level that talks about how the hardline right justifies an Iran strike on Israel. We think that this is even more so true in a world where we are giving you arguments as to why, Israel would feel encircled when you cancel a $5,000 bunker buster deal. Arguments that we need to answer of theirs. A couple of them. First is that you seem to think that your military rhetoric arguments magically go away. No discursive reason as to how you get out of this blood threat argument or why your advantage one would seem to resolve these claims. Second is that your domestic shift arguments are answered by Bieselk's explanation that Israel always looks to the largest existential ally. I think of it this way. You worry more about your older brother than the little brother that you keep under your foot at all hours of the day. Likewise, or maybe that's offensive, I don't know if that's offensive, but in any case, the largest existential threat in this specific instance is the people that are looking to proliferate, and we'd also think that an example of this would be the fact that the U.S. had to pass that December arms deal to preclude, or for that matter, get Israel to push back their arms deal a year. Not a new argument, just an example as to why that is particularly true. On case. Also, we think that the impact level arguments as to why, in a dystopian state, more aggression would be directed towards Israel and subsequently the U.S., who people largely view as responsible for this, would seem to subsume the claims that you are making on case. Now, on the case specifically. Problem with the case level arguments is, I think that we're winning arguments as to why uniqueness overwhelms the link in this specific instance. You might be getting inroads to your Israel arguments, but I think that empirics are on our side when we talk about how the continued use of U.S. aid to places such as Saudi Arabia, coupled with the fact that there would be continued money going to Israel in the status quo, would seem to lend credence to the fact that you are not able to curb any sort of extremist views. Couple that with the ideological arguments, that is a reason as to why your plan can never overcome the existential concerns that other people, or for that matter, violent non-state actors take with regard to the U.S. You're also conceding all-cause arguments as to how the acquisition of weapons continue. Last few arguments that we need here. Last few arguments that we need here. The Russia arguments would seem to be neither here nor there with regard to intel sharing. I want the argument that says that the World Health Organization checks as one, and the other argument that says, fundamentally, in a world where everyone has an interest or a shared interest in stopping the spread of disease, you are not getting traction to your impacts. Couple that with the argument that has been conceded since the LOC that says you do not specify or discuss where these bombings are taking place, and we think that we are getting larger traction to our claims, or at least a larger propensity for our impacts to be true than the arguments that you are making here. I mean, your arguments are predicated off of Israel not wanting to share information anymore. We tell you that there's no specific example as to why that's true, and if anything, U.S. commitment to Israel means that information sharing is a continued source. Regardless of whether or not you are winning arguments about Al-Qaeda expanding, you're just not getting to millions of people dying uniquely. Hearts and mind turned as well. I think that it's views a facade.
Alright, it's going to be an overview on top. This ad. Case in order.
I'm not ready.
There are multiple impact modules to our affirmative, and then the majority of them are going completely conceded. Look, there we will have to actually, and additionally, there we are winning significant link offense against their disadvantages. You're always going to be voting, and without counterplan, because try it out for the affirmative. We're running a risk of any one of our impact means you're always going to err negative in the world. You're always going to err affirmative because of try or die. They don't have a counterplan. That means they can never solve any of their when they're conceding too much about our European allies in the WHO means that they'll never actually be able to solve any of the zoonotic diseases. Go with this ad. Look, my answer to this point of information was that the 3,000 buster missiles never get delivered, which means Israel never has any of these missiles. This is pretty good because that means that if Israel knows that they can't actually strike any of the Iranian bunkers, that means that they'll never attack Iran because they know that they can never reach those bunkers because they don't have the U.S. bunker buster missiles. That means that's the MG argument number one. Means that there's never going to be this terminal defense against Israel strike against Iran. They'll never attack. Additionally, I wish we could send across the second argument. This is simply misunderstood. The fact that they're going to have to be exposed. There's more exposure to Palestine, which means that Israel is going to have to turtle up and focus inside because they have to look at Palestine instead of looking externally against Iran because the domestic issues become about Palestine. I mean, they can never actually go and look at Iran. This forces Israel to turtle up and never actually want to strike because they have to deal with the issues of Palestine. Additionally, the third argument is that they're less likely to strike because they're looking vulnerable. Look, without the United States, they're obviously going to look more vulnerable. We're the only one that's actually supporting and pulling their military aid means that Israel's going to look completely because they don't have their big brother to back them up. Which means that Israel's never going to want to actually risk a giant massive war all across the Middle East because they don't have access to weapons. They know that the U.S. isn't going to back them up because there's never going to be propensity to strike. We are just winning way too many link turns and defense against this position. Do you give it any credit? Do anything else on that? Additionally, Iran doesn't. There's no evidence to support the fact that Iran has nukes and Israel's never going to see this in the next existential crisis.
Also, there's going to be no checking terrorism for some reason.
There's not going to be any checking terrorism. They don't have a counter plan there. Our arguments are based.
Yeah, the argument about Iran not having a nuclear weapon has impact defense.
The fact that the argument is new in the MO that Israel views Iran as an existential threat because of nuclear weapons. Also that. Go to the advantage. Look, we are not talking about solely Middle East. We're not talking about solely interacting with Middle Eastern governments. We're talking about our European allies. We're talking about our Russian allies. We're talking about how these are key to combat zoonotic diseases and prevent loose nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons from being released out of Russia. That means you can on the line itself. Look, you can extend across the conceded you can use number on one argument that U.S. unconditional support makes our allies view us badly because we are not in line with their own foreign policy, which means that they're not ready to be sharing intelligence. This is uniquely clear with Russia as well because they'll only want to work with us in the war. We're not actually supporting Israel. These arguments all go cold conceded. We don't need all their arguments about how we're still giving aid to Saudi Arabia and stuff like that. It's only relevant in a world where we're talking about relations. But we're not going to be going for any of those arguments. They give terms about xenophobia. We're not going to be. None of these arguments are going to be mattering. Additionally, we would probably argue that their lack of counterplan means that the fact that we're going to under the world in the negative, that means they're still going to be selling arms to Israel. It's probably going to be much worse, and at least we have a chance to get rid of that perception of the United States, because we're at least going to be reducing some of our sales. So that means that there's never response for any of those terms. Additionally, that means their only unique offense is about this hypocritical two-facing argument. This is probably just ridiculous. The fact that the United States people wouldn't perceive the United States trying to be hypocritical two-facing when they're actually taking a genuine action to remove aid because the international community is pressuring them to do so. People will never actually see this as a two-facing thing. This argument is ridiculous. We're not going to be lying to get international credit. We are actually removing these arms sales. We're not lying we're not lying that we're taking away the arms sales and then doing it. Into the links. Actually, links first. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Uniqueness. It's the number 4 argument that goes conceded that there's an attack coming in 2013. Now, it's to the extent that the number 5 argument that U.S. poor relations with allies in Europe are meaning that we cannot get any intelligence, and specifically with Russia, how there's plans for material to get leaked from them. Go down to the impacts. And, go down the impacts. First argument we need is on the WTO. They just don't understand how the WTO actually goes. They don't do any research on zoonotic diseases. They have no idea how they can actually combat these diseases. My argument on the PMC is that the more we go into nature, the more we are actually interacting with zoonotic diseases, which means that there's a 100% probability for us to creating new zoonotic diseases, which means that we have a 100% scenario for extinction via zoonotic diseases. The WTO cannot do any of this research. This is just a ridiculous argument. Additionally, the second argument we want is a full across how I'm talking about how the U.S. is going to, I don't care about raining bombs and targets for beans. I'm talking about how the United States is going to actually be invading like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, so we get out of the PMC, which means that this is where our nuclear war scenario is going to happen. Additionally, the non-state actors are going to be getting the material from Russia. The only way that we can prevent them from doing that is increasing our relations with Russia so that we can actually secure all of these chemical, biological materials. If they get their hands on these materials and then they detonate these kind of weapons in the United States, like we talked about, that means the U.S. response is going to be immediate and responsive in invading other countries. This is going to trigger all the nuclear war scenarios that we're talking about. That is the only win-win. There's a tried after the affirmative on the scenario. We don't care. The only way that we can actually get access is actually talking with our European allies and Russians.